Doug Landis, you are a legend in SaaS. I just got to kind of describe a bit your background here. So, former growth partner at Emergence Capital. Shout out to Kevin Spain and Santi and all those great folks over there. Amen. Former chief storyteller and VP of sales productivity at Box throughout the early years. And when I'm guessing you were having to figure out a lot of stuff and you were leading that charge. Former senior director of sales productivity at the one and only Salesforce.com. My old friend, thank you so much for being on the show. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. I'm great. You can keep going because before Salesforce, I was at I was at Oracle way back in the day. It's a funny thing. I was part of the very beginning of the SDR community. It started at Oracle. It didn't start with Aaron Ross at Salesforce. Mark took that from our days at Oracle. It was bonkers. And so many of us, in fact, I'm going to see a whole bunch of them tomorrow up in Tahoe, but so many of us all started pounding the phones at Oracle, making dials, doing outbound, trying to sell software.
What was that team called back then? Was it not sales development, right?
I think it was, to be totally honest, I think actually we called that we were sales development reps.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain that we were, because from SDR you went to like NT sales, which is basically like VSB or like SMB, actually VSB. So it's NT sales. And then there was like, this is a long time ago, so I forget. I think after NT sales, it was like you were like an Oracle AE, and then you were like major accounts and then national accounts, and then you're out in the field kind of thing. Well, it started a long time ago.
Yeah, I remember meeting. I cannot believe that I'm blanking on her name, but she used to be Mark's manager in inside sales at Oracle. And again, I'm totally blanking on her name. I apologize.
Mark, who's manager?
Mark Benioff's manager at Oracle.
Yeah, Mark was on the product side. He was on the engineering side, right? So he worked. Mark ended up reporting directly to Larry, which is why they were so close. Which is why when Mark left to go start Salesforce, Larry was one of the first investors. Like put some money in, and then all of a sudden realized like, hey, we've basically built a competing product to what Oracle has, except Salesforce was in the cloud. So Mark gave Larry his money back. Pretty funny story. Yeah,
that's awesome.
But he took a lot of things. I mean, I think like much like any company you go work at, like, the multitude of companies you worked at, now you're at your own startup, you take things from those companies, you realize like, oh, that was really smart. That was really cool. I want to follow that process. I want to use this, I want to use this technology because I now know it. It's why User Gems is so valuable right now, because it allows you to follow people who are your customers, right? Or your screaming fans. Mark took a whole bunch of stuff that we did at Oracle and took it all to Salesforce
and brought it in the cloud. Well, let's talk a little bit about storytelling, because you are a legendary storytelling expert within B2B SaaS. What are some of the distinctions between storytelling at early stage startups or early stage companies versus larger established brands? Do you see any major distinctions, and how does that kind of impact your go-to-market?
I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, about how so I was talking to a buddy of mine from Salesforce yesterday, and I'll get to your question, but this is a roundabout way of getting there. And I was talking to him about how I'm working with this one company right now, super early stage startup and super technical product, and everyone sucks at doing demos because they literally just do a bunch of clicks and they show a bunch of features, right? And I was like, this is terrible. You got to tell a story, like build a narrative, like before, during, after, like whose perspective and point of view are you telling this story from? What value are they going to get out of it? And I'm telling this guy, and my buddy is now at still, once again, another massively publicly traded company. And he laughed. He goes, what's funny? I have like a team of 250 people underneath me of solution engineers who we arguably think are amazing at doing demos. And he's like, they suck just as bad as what you were describing in your little startup. So to answer your question, there is no distinction between an early stage startup and a larger company. I think the biggest difference is a bigger company. Well, there's a couple differences. A bigger company actually has more bad habits already ingrained, right? And so now you got to kind of unwind and unpack and really, really hone in on kind of retraining the brain on how to communicate differently. Because storytelling is communicating, right? And so you have more bad habits in a bigger company because you've been doing it for a lot longer. And so everyone gets kind of lazy. Box people would just like default and be like, we're cloud storage. And of course, if Aaron ever heard that, he'd fire them on the spot. Not really, but threatened to. Bigger companies have more baggage, more history of not doing a great job of it. But they also have more assets. They have more insights. They have more data to pull from. They have more to work with. Early stage company doesn't have a whole lot. And one of the challenges at an early stage company is like, well, what kind of people think that they don't have a story to tell because we're still early. And that's a myth that needs to be busted in the vein of the old show Mythbusters, which I loved, by the way. It's a myth that just needs to be busted because the reality is there are so many stories that someone can tell about themselves, their company, their product, their why, their customers, what they've learned. I mean, it's insane. Like what is available to every company, regardless of if there's your 2 people with an idea or if you're 200,000 and you've been doing business for years. There's a lot that you can actually use, but just most people kind of suck at it. Right. First of all, they think, well, I don't really have much of a story to tell because we're just getting started, at least on the startup side. And that's totally not true. Right. Yeah. One of the tips I often share is like, well, it's partially because when you're early, same problem when you're late, meaning when you're a more mature company, it's just people have a tendency of focusing too much on here's what we do and here's how we do it.
Yeah.
So by default, then you just spew out a whole bunch of facts and stats and like clicks and do all that. It's like, I don't care about that.
That reminds me of like the founder journey where when you don't have a product or maybe you have something and you don't quite have the validation behind that. Like I even think that founder story of what inspired you to pursue the pain point and that sort of thing is a great starting point.
Critical.
For, right? Like
critical. Look, in the VC world, one of the things that we try and pull out of the founders is like, okay, why you? Right. And that's that founder story, the founder journey. And if you don't have a good journey, because oftentimes we can tell right away, like, oh, you're just a hammer looking for a nail. You're just a bunch of smart engineers looking to try and solve a problem. And then the other question is, okay, why now? Right. And so, and in both of those questions, there's a ton of juice and there is a bunch of different narratives that can be extrapolated from both those questions. And so it's really important as an early stage founder, you ask yourself that, okay, why me and why now? And what can I tell about the why me and the why now that is beyond the typical like, oh, here's a problem and we're building a solution to solve it. And we think we're going to build the next X, right? Like, okay, that doesn't just tell us anything.
Yeah.
I think the challenge with a lot of early founders though, if they don't have, because oftentimes what we look, as VCs, we invest in people, right? Technology, table stakes, financing, table stakes. So at the end of the day, like we're investing in you, right? And your ability to go execute. Well, but if you think about then, what we're really looking for is like, what's your superpower?
Yeah.
What do you bring to the table that is so unique and valuable that will set you apart from everybody else, that helps us to believe that you can then out execute everybody else because you've got this it factor, right? It's similar to Hollywood. Actors, doesn't matter if you're dashing or you're like, Joe Schmo, it doesn't matter. If you have an it factor, they can work with that. And I think the same thing with founders, like what's your it factor? And it doesn't, I don't care if you went to Stanford or Harvard, MIT, or like, who cares? I like the person who like, I was in the industry for 15 years dealing with this. Like I have been a customer. I have built custom stuff myself. I realize this is a way bigger problem than what I was just experiencing on my own. Like that's interesting.
That makes sense. And it also, I think, as I look at your investments, like Zoom and, I know that founding team there, they were at, what was it? WebEx beforehand.
Yep.
That's right. And so he wanted
Eric ran product at WebEx.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember Santi introducing me to Eric, and he was like the nicest guy, and it was kind of early Zoom,
Yeah.
but he just seemed to be obsessed with solving this.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, so that's an interesting story, right? So like Eric, he knew the problem better than anybody else, I would argue. Like he just knew it. But they got turned down a lot. You know why? Part of it was because, the question was like, well, is he the right kind of founder leader? Because a lot of product leaders are not great CEOs. Not gonna lie. He has developed into an incredible CEO. But that's kind of a bet you're playing, is like, hey, you're making is like, is this guy knows the product really well, but is he the right person to be the CEO and the leader of the company? Can they grow into it? And I think there's a lot of great stories of surprises of how, like, didn't necessarily see that one coming, but they turn out to be an incredible leader. Part of it is because they've got this incredible, very high EQ. But the other thing was, the other question was, well, like have such a huge incumbent like WebEx. And even though he knew the product so well, it was like, really, can we really displace competitor like that? It's like the people that, I just saw a company raise a ton of money to build a like low code, no code CRM. And they're going after Salesforce. Like, wow, good luck. Good luck. But I mean, clearly there's a ton of competitors in Salesforce, but like, unseating Salesforce or Microsoft for that matter is going to be tough. But you got to question, like, is the rest of the market big enough that you can build a really big, interesting company?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you a quick question about developing the story at the company level and how that translates to customers, but also that personal stories. And then lastly, like, how do you map that to like a buyer journey or a sales motion? I know that's a big question, but maybe some that would take weeks to like actually figure out if, I get it. But, at a high level, like any sort of like tips to just get people going.
Yeah, totally. What's really funny is when they say, in discovery, be careful about the questions you ask. Like, don't ask like a 4-part question like you just did. I'm always, I don't know if you are, but I'm always really conscious of that, because I tend to do the same thing. And like when I'm interviewing somebody, is I'm like, well, tell me about this, and then this, and then this, because I just get so excited. The good news is that I can answer that. So like, look, at the end of the day, if you're telling a personal story or a company story or a customer story, there are some elements that are consistent across the board, right? Which is, look, every story needs to have certain components to it, period. You will know if it's not a story because it's missing these elements. I'll tell you what they are. It's not rocket science. The hardest part is actually putting them all together and actually practicing the story. The most important thing about any story is, what the hell is the point you're trying to make? Period. You got to have a point. And the reason why most people suck at telling stories, whether it's their company story or customer stories, and these people are really bad at telling customer stories, is because they're just not really clear about the point they're trying to make. And so, like, here's a great exercise. Take one of your customer stories and ask your team, your sales team, like, what's the point of this story? Just ask them, what's the point of the story? It's amazing. You got 20 reps, you'll get 20 different answers. And that immediately right there should tell you, like, oh, okay, Houston, we got a problem here. Right? Because I may think that this customer story is appropriate for this audience in this segment and this, at this stage of the buyer cycle. And you may think like, no, I use it up front. I use it right away as an example. I'm like, that's interesting. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. The reality is the reason why we're able to use it in different, in different parts of the sales process or sales cycle is because we're just not really clear about the point that we're trying to make. And so we kind of use it as like a construct of a story, which typical customer stories are all wrong, because it's like problem, solution, ROI, right? And it's, guess what? It's about like, let me tell you the story of Spotify. Let me tell you the story of LinkedIn. Let me tell you the story of YouTube. They don't have a story. Because the other thing that's usually missing in most of these stories is, who is the character? We connect with people. We connect with people and roles and titles. I don't connect with logos. I don't connect with brand names. I do, as a consumer, I have an experience with my Stanley, right? I have an experience. But you know what Stanley did really well is Stanley told a story about the person who, I'm just going to name him. His name is Mark, and he had an old car, and he was working in construction. And this was his baby that he brought to work every single day because it carries a whole liter of water and has a handle. In this case, I've got a whatever. And guess what? His car caught on fire and burned to the ground. And guess the only thing that was salvageable that he could still use after the car burned down was his Stanley mug. and he shared that story with Stanley, and Stanley bought him a new car.
Wow.
Guess what? I just told you a story about Stanley, but it wasn't really about Stanley. It was about Mark, a construction worker who actually had an issue, had a situation. So what I just shared with you, and by the way, this is totally on the fly. I literally just made this up, but I mean, it's a real story. But I shared a story with you in a matter of seconds because it had certain elements to it, right? It had a character. His name is Mark, right? It had what I call an oh shit moment. His car burned down, right? So there was, I could create more context in the story and give it some, and this is also what's typically missing in stories. It's like context, right? And context is great. So what I said, the first thing is got to be really clear. What is the point of the story that you're trying to tell? Second thing, you got to have a character or characters. Third thing is you need context, and context is created by giving us a setting, a starting point, right? So I would argue the story that I told you about Mark and Stanley it was still missing some elements because you don't know when it started or when it ended. It ended theoretically when he bought when he was given a new car. Theoretically. But it was loose, right? And so if you think about most stories that we listen to, whether it's a movie or in a book, it all starts somewhere, right? Somewhere at some point in time, because then that allows us to either go backwards in time, which often happens in movies, right? You see something that happens in an event, like someone gets murdered, all of a sudden it's like 3 years ago, and now we're going to tell you the story of the last 3 years, right? So that gives you context because now we have a setting, right? And so oftentimes, like those three things are typically what are missing in most stories. And so if you're going to tell your personal story, well, okay, great. Is your story about you? Is it about you and your partner? Is it about you and, I don't know, your significant other, whatever? Who is the character in your stories? What's the point you're trying to make? By the way, if you're going to pitch a VC, be really clear about that. The point, like you can see, you have line of sight on how to become the next, unicorn in this space. Awesome. Then great. Shape it that way. And then give us some context. Like, don't just like, oh, we're here to build the next unicorn. Here's why. It's like, all right, cool. Well, 4 years ago, when we got started, me and Mark got started working on this company. It started because we ran into this problem. You know what I mean? Like that gives it context now. It's like, oh shit, you've been doing this for 4 years. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And that relevancy, I've heard.
By the way, that was a long answer to your long question. So,
well, thank you. I know I provided a couple different elements to it, so thank you for going through it. But I had a question about the founder-led sales motion, right? And I find that like some of the great founders I know, they start to create that story, tell that story, do some of that early founder-led selling, and then once they can hit something that they can see that's repeatable and these sort of things, they start to figure out, all right, let me start to onboard some other folks. Maybe it's that first sales hire, that irrespective of level of that individual. But one of the things that I've seen too, and I remember doing this back in the day when I was in this role where I was being hired. I'll give you an example, actually. So real example, company called PunchTab. I don't know if you remember usendit.com, the file sharing.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So Ranjith
Kumar. So we do everything about file sharing.
Totally. All right, so Ranjith pings me in many years ago, and he was transitioning from Usendit because he wanted to start a new company called PunchTab, and he hired me as his first sales leader. And so, of course, I was the first salesperson, period, and then ended up carrying a bag and then growing out the team after. But what I used to do, like my pitch started off with telling Ranjith's story of how he had started Usendit, found an issue around wanting to unlock a referral. It was a gamification kind of platform, PunchTab was, and then use that to then get my initial deals. And that's actually how I started to onboard my sales reps when I started to build out the SDR team, and then and then the AEs. And I was there for about a year or so, took it to market and then, transitioned. But that was my whole thing. Like we rode that story throughout the course of my time there. I don't know if they, continued after the fact. However, that really got us to several $100,000 in deals. And, and we were,
It's super smart.
able to
It's
do
super
it.
smart. Yeah. The founder story, origin story, super, super smart because look, it tends to focus more on the why, right? It doesn't focus on the what and the how. It focuses on the why. Like, why did you create this? Why are you here? Why are we having this conversation?
Yeah.
Because a buyer, these are all the questions I'm asking. Like, I'm asking like, why am I in the middle of this? Why are we even here? And we often forget that, right? We're like, well, because we can do a bunch of stuff for you. Let me show you. It's like, no, I buy from people that I like and I trust, and people that tell stories tend to be more likable, just period. They're just more likable. Why? Because guess what? They tend to be more believable. Because it's a lot, look, you can exaggerate in your story. The fish was this big instead of this big in reality, but like, facts we immediately want to refute. This is why political races drive me nuts, because the amount of facts that they throw out, I don't care who you are, probably 30% of them are all misleading, right? Reoriented. It's like a bunch of, no offense to my lawyer friends, but a bunch of lawyers like just manipulating some numbers to show, they're like to try and make it sound believable. And people are like, I believe it. Not that we're getting political here, but it's just the reality is like you spew out a whole bunch of facts. We're the number one, we just do this better than anybody else in the world. I'm like, bullshit, you do not. And so like you come at me with you come at me with stats and numbers like that, I'm going to refute that. We're already starting off on the wrong foot. Right. But you come at me and you tell me this founder story about, why this seemed like such a great idea. Well, clearly your founder had experience in there. That's like, that's interesting. I want to know more.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, we're now developing a relationship because it's about communicating.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to switch gears quickly to this concept that you sort of alluded to a second ago, which was like, if you're BSing people with these stats and things like that, with it, maybe at some point that was a little easier. Although I would say, I don't know if BSing has ever been acceptable, but we're all trying to figure out this moat, right? And I think these days you talked about like technology table stakes, financing table stakes, these sort of things. If you're a SaaS brand out there, especially right now, how do you start to develop a moat in this highly competitive environment, given all the macro stuff going on?
How do you develop a moat? Gosh, it's really, I mean, look, in this environment right now, I don't, if I were a founder, I would be like all hands on deck on product. Like, you're not going to sell your way out of this market and situation. What I mean by that is like the product will help create defensibility and will help create differentiation if you're building the product well, and if you're building the product that solves a problem that people absolutely give a shit about. So some of it's your market, the market you're going after. And obviously right now people are learning like, whoop, got to pivot, because the market we're going after is way more of a nice to have than it is a must have. It's like people think like, this is really cool, but I'm only making one buying decision this year and it's not it. This is not it, right? And you can even think about your own personal lives. Like, what's the one big buying decision you're going to make this year? And like all the other things that people are trying to sell you on Instagram. Do you really want it or need it? Probably not. The truth is so there's the market complexity. And so you got to be really clear about your ICP and why do they care and why are they your target and who really has this problem. And it may force you to realize that some of your ICP is, maybe 50, 60, 70% of your ICP isn't a good fit anymore. The other question is like, okay, so when you do identify this problem area and that it's actually an absolute must have, then you got to go all in on product. You have to. The product has to work. The product has to deliver on the promise, because people cannot afford to make risky bets right now. They just can't. And that's the truth. Any decision right now feels inherently, as me as a buyer, that it's a much riskier decision because, money is not cheap anymore. Right. And if I go out and spend money on software that I think is going to deliver X value, that is going to help, drive top line revenue or help mitigate some risk or cut our costs in some way, shape or form, and it doesn't, well, my neck is on the line now, right. As a buyer. And I don't know if I really want to do that right now
Yeah.
because, whatever, I just had a baby or not true, but like, life stuff
Yeah.
is going on. And so like, look, I think a mode is like just knowing your market inside and out, knowing your buyers inside and out, and being really honest. And this is a question we would always ask, kind of when founders would come present to us is like, all right, what would your customers say if you told them that you were going out of business? What would they say? Because guess what? We're going to ask them. Because we want to know, we call us like, we want to hear the sucking sound from the market. The market is like, oh my gosh, this is really amazing and can't live without it, right? It's kind of like when ChatGPT came on the market, everyone's like, oh, what? This is incredible. So it's like, we're looking like, you got to know your market inside and out. And you have to be an absolute must have. And if you're not, then pivot. Do what you got to do from a product perspective to get the capabilities out there that allow you to deliver enough value to where you are an absolute must-have. Period.
Are there any unique signals that indicate I got a must-have? Because I've been in situations where I've done a lot of customer discovery research and these sort of things, and the respondents are like, "Oh, this is awesome! Yeah, sign me up, that kind of thing." And then it's essentially a false positive, right?
Yeah,
so any really like really concrete signals?
I mean, yeah, paying customers, right? But willingness to pay for it is I feel like, right now, especially in this PLG motion, we tend to give away a lot of stuff, right? And as a buyer, I'm like, cool, I get to use all this for very little because I'm getting almost full access to the product. And I think that's like, you just have to be really honest. Be like, cool, now it's time to pay. And we're going to shut it off. And if they're not like, no, screaming, I will do whatever it takes to actually pay for this, then you're like, okay, then you don't have a strong enough signal, right? Because to your point, look, I feel like, especially when you're doing like discovery calls, not like somewhat sales discovery calls, but like you're trying to get a sense of the market and be like, okay, do they really care about this? You're going to get a lot of people that tell you what you want to hear, right? And at the end of the day, it's like, are they willing to put their money where their mouth is, right? If it's like, yeah, this is amazing, but the moment you hear that but, you're like, uh-oh, we got Houston, we got a problem. And maybe, literally just happened to me yesterday, working with this company, we do this demo for this guy, and he's like, man, geez, you guys built a Porsche. Like, your product's too good. Because now I have to go actually sell it internally to a whole bunch of other departments because the product is so robust, it's going to impact all of them. And he's like, and to be honest, I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that. He's like, I want it, but you're now introducing capabilities that pull in other people in the department, and I just don't know. So I'm just going to set some expectations here. I just don't know if we're ever going to be able to become a customer. I was like, okay. So founder and I were talking. I'm like, make note of this, because if we can't convert them to a customer, do you know what we need to do? We need to reevaluate whether or not that's the right target market we should be going after. Right? They get the problem, love the product, can't actually go execute and become an actual paying customer. That's an issue. So let's go find some other folks.
Awesome. Doug, thank you so much for being on the show here today. I know I listed out like tons of questions here. I feel like we could speak all day. If folks wanted to, first of all, learn more about your advisory services and what you're doing, I know you're working on a couple of different ventures.
Yeah.
What are the best ways to engage with you?
LinkedIn's always an easy place because I live and breathe on LinkedIn. I haven't been posting a lot lately because I've been so heads down and helping to build some companies right now. And in fact, I'm taking a lot of copious notes so I can share them with people because there's, super early stage is hard. Especially, it's just hard. So LinkedIn is a great place. DougLandis.com or dladvisory.com or dladvisory.co. They both go to the same place. My website. And then, you can always just shoot me an email. I'm just douglandis@gmail.com.
Awesome.
Easy peasy.
Thank you so much again, my friend. It's great to see you.
Good to see you, brother.
Congratulations on everything and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you too, buddy.